Hey guys, what's going on? I'm Illegal Mist, and today we're going to talk about why you should pull for Supreme Kael if you have 110 voids. Let's get right into it. I already have the shards to pull Supreme Kael, so I might have a slight bias towards pulling him, as for myself, it's not going to cost me any money. If you need to spend money to get shards, it's up to you to make the decision on whether you think it's right for you or not, but I'm going to tell you all of the pros that I see with him. For Supreme Kael's kit, his A1 is an AoE that has a 75% chance when booked of placing a 25% weaken. This debuff is also irresistible, just like every other debuff or ability that he has. We'll talk about this later, but it's an essential piece to his kit as to why I think he's so useful. His A2 is an AoE ability that places 3 strong poisons for 2 turns. This is also irresistible, and he's also able to increase the duration of all enemy debuffs by 1 turn, also being irresistible. This skill gets booked up to 100%, and he's also able to have a 3-turn cooldown when booked. For his A3, it's another AoE that places increased accuracy on all allies before attacking, and then it has a 100% chance when booked of placing decreased resistance on all enemies for 2 turns. This debuff can't be resisted either, and he'll also fill his turn meter by 10% for each decreased resistance placed by this skill. So if you use this ability on Hydra, you'll get a 40% turn meter increase, as well as the decreased resistance on all enemies and increased resistance on your team. This skill also synergizes really well with his A2, as his A2 increases the duration of all enemy debuffs. Decreased resistance can be up 100% of the time if you use his A3 followed by his A2, because the A2 increases the duration of all enemy debuffs. For Supreme Kael's passive, he decreases each target's accuracy, crit rate, and crit damage by 3% for each poison on them. The reason Supreme Kael is so good is because his kit synergizes incredibly well. If you're able to place 3 poisons on the enemy, you'll decrease their accuracy by 9%. For PvE, this passive is incredibly strong. The fact that you can decrease the enemy's accuracy, crit rate, and crit damage by 9% with just his A2 ability is incredibly strong. If you're able to have him cycle back and place more poisons on the enemy, or if you have another poison champion on your team, you're able to effectively reduce all of the crit rate on the enemy, as well as substantially decrease the accuracy on them. I don't think people truly understand how phenomenal this skill is. With the ability to use his AoE with 3 poisons, and increasing the duration of these poisons to be on a 3-turn cooldown, each enemy should in theory have 9% less accuracy, crit rate, and crit damage all of the time. If you use Kael with another poisoner, and you get this up to 9 poisons, and then also place decreased accuracy, you can reduce your resistance requirements by a substantial amount. So if we were to bring in Supreme Kael against a new boss that had 1000 accuracy, if he was able to place 9 poisons, he could take our resistance requirement from 1140 all the way down to 870 just with his poisons alone. If we were able to speed tune it and manage to land a decreased accuracy along with those poisons, we could bring our resistance requirements all the way from 1140 down to 500. 500 is a much more realistic number for us, and I know a lot of people are able to hit that already. Now, if we brought in an increased resistance champion, those numbers would change drastically. Typically, a boss with 1000 accuracy, while we have increased resistance on our team, we only need 760 resistance. If we went in with Supreme Kael with 9 poisons, we would only need 580 accuracy along with the increased resistance. But if we brought in decreased accuracy, Supreme Kael's poisons, and an increased resistance champion, we'd go from needing 1140 resistance all the way down to 333. I know these numbers might seem ridiculous as far as a boss having 1000 accuracy, but the truth of the matter is, Raid only has certain amounts of stats that it can increase in order for us to have content be more difficult. Because of Supreme Kael's passive and using champions with decreased accuracy and increased resistance, we'll be able to drastically change our resistance requirements. If you're planning to pull for a guaranteed champion, then you probably enjoy the game, and if you're spending the money to get 110 void shards, or if you saved them up like I did, you're probably in it for the long haul. If you're in it for the long haul, a champion like Supreme Kael is going to be able to last the test of time. Bringing in a champion like Supreme Kael 2 years from now against bosses that have insanely high accuracy could be essential for you to be able to take them down. If we were to use Supreme Kael with 3 of his poisons instead of the 9, we can also see how that would work. A boss again with 1000 accuracy, we need resistance requirement of 1140 to have a 95% chance of resisting that. If we were to bring in an increased resistance champion, we'd need 760 resistance to get about 95% resist chance. With Supreme Kael on the team, just placing his poisons, like any other poisoner champ would do, that lowers our requirement for resistance from 1140 to 870. That's 270 less resistance that you get for having a champion that probably fills a similar role to the other champions that you have that you need poisons from. And if we went in, we had Supreme Kael place 3 poisons, we had a decreased accuracy champion as well on the team, we'd only need 600 resistance. With an increased resistance champion, we can have that all the way down to 400 resistance. So again, with just 3 poisons, a decreased accuracy, and increased resistance champion, we can go from needing 1140 resistance all the way down to 400. And this scales like exponentially when we get to even higher numbers. If we said the boss had 10,000 accuracy, Supreme Kael with 3 poisons alone would bring the resistance requirement from 10,140 down to 9,240. In that same situation, if a boss had 10,000 accuracy and Supreme Kael placed 9 poisons, we'd go from 10,140 resistance required to 7,440. I don't know how to describe it other than severely under the radar when we talk about the accuracy reduction that Supreme Kael does just from placing his poisons. Supreme Kael's A3 is also going to scale extremely well the longer we play Raid. If we went up against enemy that had 1,000 resistance, if we wanted to land our debuffs at a 95% chance, we'd need 1,014 accuracy. If we had increased accuracy, that would go down to 676. Supreme Kael completely changes these numbers and makes your teams way more accessible. If we go up against an enemy that has 1,000 resistance, and we bring in Supreme Kael, and he uses his A3 ability, which is irresistible decreased resistance, along with a increased accuracy for your whole team, your champions will go from needing 1,014 accuracy all the way down to 343. So not only is his passive super under the radar right now, but his A3 is going to be scaling so well the longer we play Raid and the higher the resistance and accuracy requirements become. The other thing about his kit that I think goes severely under the radar is the fact that he increases the duration of all debuffs on the enemy. If we have a champion like Ugo go in and place decreased defense and block buffs for 2 turns on a 3-turn cooldown, Supreme Kael can go in, use his A2 ability, he'll be able to keep block buffs on the enemy for 100% of the time. The ability to be able to increase the duration of our buffs or debuffs is so strong, and I think the increased duration of debuffs often gets overlooked. The fact that it's on an ability that also places 3 poisons can be incredibly good if you're using him for a dungeon like Dragon. He could also go on a team for something like Ice Golem, where another teammate places decreased attack and someone else places HP burns. He can increase the duration of all of your HP burns as well as your decreased attack. One of the other main reasons that you should pull for Supreme Kael if you have the opportunity to do so is the fact that it's not going to reset your mercy system. While this hasn't been explicitly said yet, every other guaranteed champion has not reset our mercy counters, and I don't expect it to be the first time this happens. My mercy is currently around 76, so if I pull my shards for Supreme Kael and I don't get a legendary, I'll be sitting right around 180 void shards. That means I'll only have to pull 40 more to be guaranteed a legendary, and I'll be able to use that in conjunction with a 10x on a champion that I find is superior to others, and I'll have the highest chance possible for myself to get the champion that I want. Another area I think Supreme Kael could be really fantastic in is using him to duo or trio some of the harder dungeons. A dungeon like Dragon 10 Hard isn't extremely difficult, but using a champion like Supreme Kael along with a champion like Staltus could make your runs extremely fast. For Staltus, if you're using him in a speed team, you don't need him to have high accuracy as it's not required to reflect the poisons onto the boss. If you want to use Staltus' stun ability though, you'll need to make sure that he has accuracy. If you wanted to use Supreme Kael and a champion like Staltus to duo Dragon 10 Hard, all you would need to do to make sure that your Staltus has enough accuracy is to have a max Great Hall and 5 additional accuracy. With Supreme Kael's ability to decrease the enemy's resistance along with increase your accuracy, you only need 57 accuracy if both of these are up. While Staltus may outrun the increased accuracy buff because it's on a 3-turn cooldown and it's only viable for 2 turns, because Supreme Kael places the decreased resistance along with the increased duration, the enemy should have it up 100% of the time. If Staltus doesn't have increased accuracy, he needs 85 accuracy to be able to land his stuns or any other debuffs. If you bring Supreme Kael on the team with him, it will drastically lower your accuracy requirements, so much so that you don't even have to worry about it. While this might be a little bit of an extreme case because the enemies have very low resistance, it applies for any duo or trio content that you have. For myself, I'm very interested to try Supreme Kael on a counterattack team. Because all of his abilities are AoE, if you put him with War Master, he should be able to do a significant amount of damage, even if you don't have him on a counterattack team in Hydra. Additionally, he's going to be able to provide your team with the increased accuracy and decreased resistance on the enemy, so your accuracy requirements will drop significantly. If I were using him for Hydra, I probably would lock out his A2, as I think the 3 poisons on each enemy will probably overload the debuff bar and you might not be able to land your provokes. If you're using him specifically for Hydra, a Provoke set would be very good, as all of his abilities are AoE. But if you're using him for general dungeon content, you could put him in Regen or Stun Gear. If you put him in Stun Gear, you'd need to make sure another champion with him was able to provide him with some sort of healing. But if you wanted to use him to duo, and you didn't want to have the other champion heal him, you just have to put him in a Regen set. If you're a very endgame account, you probably don't have a spot where Supreme Kael automatically slots into. The longer you play this game, the more you'll come to understand that resistance and accuracy are really one of the most defining features that Raid uses in order to make content more difficult. There's essentially 5 ways that Plarium can make the game more difficult. They can increase the damage that the enemy does, they can increase the amount of health and survivability of the enemy, they can increase the speed, increase the resistance so that it's more difficult for us to land our debuffs, or they can increase the accuracy for the enemy so it's harder for us to resist what they're trying to do. With a champion like Supreme Kael, for himself, he's able to completely negate one of those 5 ways that Plarium can make the game more difficult, and it scales boundlessly. Again, if the enemy has a million resistance, Supreme Kael is still going to land his abilities. He'll also enable your other debuff champions, so instead of needing to have high accuracy requirements, he can go in and significantly lower their threshold, lowering the way that Plarium can make the game more difficult. On top of that, his passive comes in, and he'll be able to decrease the accuracy of the enemy by up to 30% if he lands all 10 of his poison debuffs. If he's able to go in and land the poisons, and place the decreased resistance and increased accuracy, he's significantly reducing 2 of the 5 ways that Plarium can make the game more difficult. So when I say this champion is extremely good, and I highly recommend going for him, I mean it because I'm coming at it with a viewpoint like that. I'm sure there's ways that Plarium can make the game more difficult than just those 5 specific stats on the enemy, but I just want to highlight the point that those are really the main ways that all of the content gets more difficult. So if we think about a champion like Supreme Kael, he might not be super viable for endgame accounts right now, but I can assure you, the more difficult the game becomes and the longer the game is out, the more Supreme Kael is going to shine. He might not be a meta champion for any stage 2 years from now, but I can almost guarantee you, if you have him, he's going to be a champion that you slot in because he provides so much for the team. I hope you guys seriously consider pulling for Supreme Kael if you have the money or opportunity to do so. I think this champion is going to be one that Plarium regrets making a guaranteed champion, and I venture to say that he's probably one of the best guaranteed champions that Plarium's ever done. That's all I've got in this video. I hope you guys come back tomorrow to watch my polls for Supreme Kael and see all the other Void champions that I got, but otherwise I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.